So I am really delighted to wish all of you a very warm welcome to this seminar today. My name is Ingeborg, and I am the director of the Research Center MF CASR, which is co-hosting today's event in cooperation with the Critical Islamic Studies Initiative. And it is indeed a great pleasure and an honor for us to host this event and to welcome Professor Lena Salaymeh of the École Pratique des Hautes Études and the University of Oxford, as well as the discussants, Professor Junaid Quadri of the University of Illinois and Sami Al-Daghistani to our online academic space. I'll give the floor now to Dr. Al-Daghistani, who will present the speakers and the topic, and who will also chair this session. Dr. Al-Daghistani is a research scholar at the Middle East Institute at Columbia University, an associate faculty member of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and a postdoctoral fellow in Islamic Studies at MF Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society here in Oslo. So please, Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liv, for this kind introduction, and to both of you with Esther as well as MF CASR for co-hosting the event. Welcome everyone to our second Critical Islamic Studies webinar. We're very eager to have Professor Lena Salaymeh and Professor Junaid Quadri with us today. Our first Critical Islamic Studies event was launched in October 2021 at the MF Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society in Oslo, when we hosted Professor Wal Halak and Professor Islam Daya. Our consortium is an academic unit at MF whose aims are to engage with both historical and modern analysis of and research in the field of Islamic studies. The research group considers both Arabic and non-Arabic texts as well as theoretical literature on the subject in order to interrogate the nature and boundaries of the field and to deconstruct hegemonic discourses and historical processes of Eurocentrism, then paint a partial or biased image of Islam and Muslim society. It is devised as a platform to further implement current research on Islam at MF and more broadly in Oslo, as well as to seek international collaboration. Professor Salaymeh will discuss a topic that is pertinent not only to our collective, obviously, but also for the field of Islamic studies in general, and will in part be based on her recent article on decolonial translation. So Lena Salaymeh is British Academy Global Professor in the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at Oxford University and Professor at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. She's also co-organizer of the Decolonial Comparative Law Project at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative and Private International Law in Hamburg. Salaymeh is a scholar of law and history, and she specializes in Jewish and Islamic jurisprudence and critical theory. Her scholarship on law and religion brings together legal history and critiques of secularism. She received the Guggenheim Fellowship for her first book, The Beginnings of Islamic Law, Late Antique Islamic Legal Traditions, and also received the American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion in the category of Textual Studies. Salaymeh has had various visiting positions. She received her JD from Harvard and her PhD in Legal and Islamic History from UC Berkeley. Junaid Quadri is our discussant, who is an associate professor of history and also director of undergraduate studies in history and director of the program in religious studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He teaches courses in Middle Eastern civilization, Islamic intellectual history, colonialism, and modernity in the Muslim world. His research attempts to better understand developments in Islamic thought, especially in the modern period. His first book, Transformations of Tradition, Islamic Law in Colonial Modernity, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2021, studies the encounter between Islamic law and colonial power, examining Sharia discourses as they develop in relation to fundamental categories of modernity. He holds a PhD from the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University, and in 2014-15 academic year, he taught at the Faculty of Islamic Studies in Doha, Qatar. Warm welcome to both of you again. Professor Salaymeh will speak for approximately 30-35 minutes or so, and then we will engage in a debate and take some questions from the audience as well. If you would like to contribute a question, write it down in the Q&A function, but we can possibly also grant you to use the mic. Professor Salaymeh, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for the invitation to be here and for that very kind introduction. I just want to make sure that my PowerPoint is working and you can see the slideshow. Thank you, Esther, for the confirmation. I appreciate that. I want to thank Junaid for participating as a panelist, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I must admit that I was surprised and excited when I learned about this series, because I have seen very little critical scholarship in Islamic studies, particularly of the pre-modern Islamic tradition. Support for or interest in critical scholarship is rare in Islamic studies. In my experience, many senior scholars in the field attack, disrespect, misunderstand, and marginalize critical scholarship. I believe that critical Islamic studies is an aspiration rather than an established subfield of study. Of course, I have seen that an increasing number of scholars in Islamic studies are labeling their work as critical or even decolonial. Unfortunately, I have also noticed that most of the scholarship fundamentally misunderstands critical theory or decoloniality. So from the outset, I want to be clear that it is a greater disservice to scholarship to do bad critique than not to do critique at all. Obviously, many academics misuse and misapply critical theory in a variety of fields. Nonetheless, in a field that is as politicized and as insular as Islamic studies, mixed comprehensions and misapplications of critique are much more detrimental. Critical theory is a tool, and you need extensive training to use it effectively. So with this cautionary warning stated, my plan for today's talk is to begin with a broad discussion of common misunderstandings of critique in Islamic studies, shift to a summary of critical heuristics in Islamic studies that I've written about, and then move on to explaining my work on decolonial translation. I structure my talk this way in order to emphasize the importance of critical theory training for understanding decoloniality. And as I move through the talk, my slides will include citations to some of my publications that explain my points more thoroughly. So let's begin with 3 common misunderstandings of critique. First, there is a significant difference between critique and criticism. Scholarly criticism of sources of power, such as Orientalism, modernity, or the myth of modernity, the West, orthodoxy, or patriarchy, are not necessarily critiques. Identifying an object of criticism is not the same as thinking critically about the object. This needs to be emphasized because too many scholars in Islamic studies conflate criticism with critique. Indeed, this is also why scholars misconstrue critique of scholarship as criticism of scholars. Second, critical scholarship is not the same as expressing progressive politics. Writing about topics associated with progressive politics, such as gender, women, sexuality, race, or ethnicity, is not the same as doing critical scholarship. You can write about all of these topics using non-critical heuristics or from non-critical perspectives. So by way of example, in recent years, we've seen male scholars of Islamic studies who lack training in feminist studies or any related field, but view themselves as progressive, making problematic statements about women's issues. Their statements and scholarship misuse critical ideas. Many scholars write about progressive topics while holding progressive political opinions, but using uncritical heuristics. Third, there is no simple causal relationship between location or identity and critique. Scholars in any geographical location and of any identity can be either critical or colonial. So one of the more asinine comments I've heard recently from an Islamic studies scholar is, quote, "I lived in the region for several years, so I can claim to be decolonial," end quote. Okay, I should not have to emphasize this, but where you were born or raised or lived for many years has no bearing on whether or not your scholarship is critical. So I've written about this problematic understanding of identity relating to scholarship repeatedly, but I find that it is one of the most difficult critical principles for scholars to digest because they are so accustomed to positioning their work in terms of superficial posturing. So let me give another example. Muslims in the field of Islamic studies should not presume that they have insider knowledge because of their identity, just as non-Muslims in the field should not presume that they are more objective. Scholars who are minorities, progressives, or just nice people can all write scholarship that is oppressive, bigoted, or colonial. Likewise, I emphasize differentiating between Western, Eurocentric, and colonial. Too often, scholars think they are being critical when they are actually being analytically sloppy. So these 3 common misunderstandings of critique reflect the rather widespread tendency to impersonate critique rather than doing it. An Islamic studies scholar at a Global North institution once told me that graduate students do not need training in critical theory because they can learn it through osmosis. Fortunately, his ignorance is widely shared in Islamic studies because I hear and experience this false presumption frequently. Critical scholarship necessitates many years of training and study. Critique is a specialization, not a hobby. So I want to provide a quick example to synthesize some of my comments. One might assume that studies of Muslim women are more critical than the norm in Islamic studies. Scholars who seek to criticize conventional studies of Muslim women, or scholars who have progressive politics, or scholars who are themselves women, often author studies of Muslim women. None of these factors, however, prevents colonial heuristics from being used in studies of Muslim women. I've identified 3 aspects of colonial feminist heuristics, which I've observed in both conventional scholarship and scholarship that criticizes conventional scholarship. And they're posted on the screen. First, colonial feminists engaged in decontextualized comparisons. They consistently compare women in the global north to stereotypes about women in the Muslim world without comparing Muslim men and women or comparing non-Muslim men and women. These inconsistent comparisons are the source of significant misrepresentations of Muslim women. Second, colonial feminists view Muslim women through the heteronormative male gaze. That is, when colonial feminists assess Muslim women's practices, they often unintentionally implement the normative assumptions of Western heterosexual males. Third, colonial feminists incorrectly presume that Western women enjoy full autonomy or fail to recognize that women everywhere do not enjoy full autonomy. In critiquing colonial feminism, I do not simply criticize it, express progressive viewpoints, or dismiss it as the product of a colonial identity or location. Instead, I show that critique necessitates a sustained and intensive challenge to colonial ways of thinking or colonial scholarly practices. Conventional scholarly practices are evident in not only what people write, but also how they write. I want to focus on one example that encapsulates for me the absence of critical approaches in Islamic studies, and that's citation practices. We are now several generations removed from both the 19th century establishment of Islamic studies in the global north and the mid-20th century critique of Orientalism. In the citation practices of global north scholars in Islamic studies, we can identify a new canon of scholarship in the field. Much like the previous canon, men at global north institutions using conventional heuristics author this canon. So whereas 19th century Orientalists used philology to criticize or essentialize the pre-modern Islamic tradition, 21st century scholars use philology to defend or essentialize Islam in different ways. Today's canon of conventional scholarship is not a natural or inevitable creation. Citation practices reflect power inequalities in a scholarly field. Powerful institutions in the global north hire scholars who fit within their culture and ideology. Because these scholars are associated with elite institutions, their scholarship, irrespective of its quality, is more likely to be cited and canonized. Canonical scholars are more likely to act as gatekeepers in the field by serving as reviewers for hiring and promotion processes, manuscript submissions, and grant funding review. So this situation, of course, is compounded by a well-documented gender bias, and here I would recommend the work of Kisha Ali on the gender bias, specifically of the field of Islamic studies. Critical scholars are generally excluded from elite institutions and therefore do not benefit from the advantages of being affiliated with those institutions. These dynamics shape academia in general, of course, but they have more damaging implications in small, politicized, and misogynistic fields like Islamic studies. So simply put, structural dynamics shape the production of knowledge in ways that prevent critical scholarship. On the slide is an inclusiveness statement that attempts to respond to these structural inequalities. I collaborate with a group of concerned female scholars with experience serving on editorial boards or as editors in Islamic studies and related area studies to write the statement. The inclusiveness statement attempts to address some pervasive problems of bias. Scholars who are female, underrepresented, live or work in the global south, and or write in a language other than English are excluded systematically in both citations and substantive discussions. So the objective of the statement is to encourage authors to tackle these patterns of exclusion by being more inclusive in their research and writing. Inclusiveness in citation practices will not necessarily lead to citing more critical scholarship, but it can help reorient scholarly production away from colonial centers of power that actively suppress critical scholarship. So the statement was sent to dozens of editors and editorial members. I don't think it was actually implemented as far as I know. It's an open access text, so please feel free to use it, including in a modified form. And if you'd like to receive it, you can email me to get it. Okay, with all of those kind of disclaimers, now we can move on to our main question, which is, what is critique? Critique means different things to different scholars, of course. And as I use critique, I do not refer exclusively to the Frankfurt School of Critique, for example. I use critique and critical theory to encompass a broad range of theoretical tools. In my opinion, critique identifies and challenges hegemonic power. There are no universal methods for how to do critique. Critique is particular to a set of sources, spaces, and situations. I often advise that the first step towards critique is not making any assumptions. This means that you should question everything, particularly the terms and concepts you use in your research. So I want to give you another example. An Islamic studies researcher who aspires to be critical once told me that, quote, God is the author of the Quran, end quote, and that, quote, Islam is a form of colonialism, end quote. Now, to be clear, I do not care about the theological or potentially pejorative implications of these statements. The problem with these statements is that they are based on misconceptions about what authorship is and what colonialism is. In both cases, there is extensive critical scholarship that contests using the modern concepts of authorship and colonialism in pre-modern context. Rather than assuming that he understood the meaning of these concepts or that he was being critical, my interlocutor should have done much more extensive research, and then he might have realized that his criticism is not critique. Indeed, he should not have assumed that his reading comprehension in the language of critique is the same as his speaking ability, because it is not. Critical research, in my opinion, begins with a critical research question, not a descriptive object of study, whether that be a text or a person or a place. Beginning with a research object results in identifying a methodology for scrutinizing the research object instead of identifying a methodology for answering a research question. And because the research object is not in and of itself critical, the conventional heuristics for scrutinizing it will rarely yield critical results. So as I have emphasized, critique is not a position or status or point of view. Critique is the outcome of critical heuristics. I demonstrated this point frequently in my book, which began with the critical research question, how did Islamic law begin? How we understand Islam's beginnings shapes how we understand the Islamic tradition at any point in time. A beginning is a framework of meaning. My book illustrates that the Islamic tradition, like any other tradition, began in a dialogical relationship with contemporaneous and predecessor traditions. This insight is true not only for Islam's beginnings, but for every tradition in any time and place. My book, The Beginnings of Islamic Law, illustrates two interrelated forms of critique, deconstruction and reconstruction. Accordingly, the odd-numbered chapters delineate deconstruction by analyzing problematic heuristics and assumptions in Islamic studies in the global north, while the even-numbered chapters apply these insights to three reconstructive case studies about prisoners of war, circumcision, and wife-initiated divorce. Each of the odd-numbered methodological chapters lays the groundwork for the subsequent even-numbered chapters case study. And in turn, each of the three case studies demonstrates an example of the recycled art of Islamic jurisprudence. The book focuses on four problematic dominant methods in the field of Islamic studies in the global north. The first is searching for so-called original Islamic sources using the problematic notion of source criticism. The second is searching for Islam's so-called origins based on a false notion of authenticity. The third is defining and perceiving Islam through the narrow lens of orthodoxy. And the fourth is imposing a Protestant Christian notion of religion. First, instead of source criticism, I offer a post-foundationalist understanding of late antique Islamic sources, advocating that they be read critically and in conjunction with each other. Post-foundationalism is basically a third way between positivism and relativism. My approach is based on horizontality. Critical scholars do not correct or judge sources. I do not presume to be in a position of authority in relation to any given Islamic historical text. More specifically, I reject the incorrect assumptions underlying the depiction of Islamic sources as uniquely unreliable or biased. I read all the available historical evidence critically without assigning superiority to any source. In short, I advocate historiography instead of textual studies. Second, instead of searching for origins, I recognize that Islam simply began in late antiquity and constituted a fusion of the late antique world in which it began. The Islamic tradition does not have a tangible origin or evolution. There are only shifts and transformations in Islamic practices within concrete Muslim communities. The shared Islamic context, rather than essential features of any tradition, clarifies whatever resemblances there may be between traditions. I offer the model of recycling to counter the uncritical notions of borrowing or influence that plague the field of Islamic studies. Third, instead of conflating orthodoxy and the Islamic tradition, I advocate that heterodoxy and dissenting voices within the Islamic tradition have equal claims. The linear developmental narrative of Islamic history that dominates the field identifies Islamic orthodoxy as the mature or classical form of Islam. This constructed notion of so-called classical Islam reflects orthodoxy and conceals uncritical notions about original, authentic, or essential Islam. This is why it is imperative to recognize that late antique Islam and medieval Islam was not like medieval Islam, and medieval Islam was not as homogeneous as Orthodox claims suggest. Fourth, instead of imposing the category of religion, I advocate that we recognize Islam as a multifaceted, pluralistic, and fluctuating tradition. A tradition is a changing array of ideas and practices shared by groups over time. I explained the concept of tradition in my book, and I've continued to elaborate it in my subsequent writings. So I want to emphasize now that my book is not only for scholars of pre-modern Islam. One of the primary impediments to critical scholarship that I have observed in studies of modern Islam is that scholars rely on conventional and problematic scholarship about the pre-modern Islamic tradition. Indeed, connecting again to my comments about citation practices, even critically inclined scholars of modern Islam typically rely on the same conventional canon about pre-modern Islam. So just by way of example, I cannot understand why any scholar of modern Islam cites to Joseph Shah's outdated and problematic work. Too many scholars of modern Islam build their work on the shaky foundations of intellectually colonial scholarship. One cannot write critical scholarship about modern Islam unless it is based on critical scholarship about pre-modern Islam. As mentioned already, challenging the category of religion is a crucial component of critique in Islamic studies. One reason that religion should be contested is that it is anachronistic. To recognize the anachronism of the notion of religion, I researched the category of being Muslim from a critical historical perspective. In an article about charity taxation, I demonstrated that late antique legal authorities required minors, but not slaves, to pay the charity tax because political belonging, rather than belief, triggered the obligation to pay. I argued that many pre-modern Muslim jurists view paying the charity tax as enacting Muslim citizenship. The Islamic taxation system was, from the beginning, a means of taxing both members and quasi-members. It corresponded to a political framework for defining citizenship of Muslims and semi-citizenship of non-Muslims. Being Muslim in late antiquity was not related to the notion of religion. Another reason that the notion of religion should be contested is that it is an instrument of secular ideology. Denaturalization of hegemonic modern concepts is crucial to critical thinking. So let me give a parallel example here. Critical scholars of race challenge the simple notion that race exists rather than being constructed by racism. Likewise, critical scholars of religion challenge the simple notion that religion exists rather than being constructed by secular ideology. A primary generator of secularism is the secular nation state. And the modern nation state creates a problem space in which it constantly demarcates a line between politics and religion. This is not a line that can be drawn empirically. It is a line that the modern nation state draws and moves in accordance with its particular material and ideological objectives. Put differently, the modern nation state differentiates between two secular notions, secular politics and religion, because it serves its interest to do so. So in a series of articles, I've illustrated that secular ideology transforms pre-modern traditions by defining them as religions through three dimensions that are simultaneously related and conflicting. And those three dimensions are religiosity, religious law, and religious groups. Based on our studies of multiple jurisdictions, my co-author and I, Shailavi and I, identified how secular legal reasoning defines each of the angles in the secularization triangle shown on the slide. So these three notions, religiosity, religious law, and religious groups, are not natural dimensions. They are the byproducts of secular ideology. The critique of religion is a component of a broader critical engagement, identifying the entanglement and disentanglement of secularism and the Islamic tradition. As I have summarized thus far, my previous scholarship has demonstrated both how secular ideas distort the pre-modern Islamic tradition and how secular states secularize traditions by converting them into religions. Yet secular states are not the only contributors to secularism. Some of my research examines how contemporary Muslim actors secularize the pre-modern Islamic tradition by using it as an ornamental resource for their hybrid secular Islamized ideas. Specifically, my article comparing Islamic and international laws of war identified a parallel three-step secular legal reasoning process shared by Al-Qaeda and the US military. The first is identifying the modern nation state as a centripetal legal force such that law is in the service of the state. The second is allowing secular law to delineate ethics. The third is accepting secular law's construction of religious law as a legal code. Both the US military and Al-Qaeda elide orthodox categories of civilians and expand the category of combatant primarily by rendering civilians as probable combatants. So this critique highlights the relationship between contemporary Islamists and the pre-modern tradition without collapsing the tradition within orthodoxy. This critical move should be differentiated from scholarship produced inside secularism's problem space. An enormous amount of recent conventional scholarship in Islamic studies attempts to differentiate between religion and society or religion and politics. Contemporary scholarly attempts to define Islam and related debates about the concept of Islamicate are theoretically stuck in a false conundrum. The problem is not terminology or definition, but rather the epistemology of scholars who are trapped inside the ideology of secularism. Okay, so now having outlined some critical impulses in my work on the pre-modern and the modern Islamic tradition, we can now begin to discuss the multi-layered critical arguments that underlie my article on decolonial translation, which is the article that Sami asked me to discuss today. So I want to begin by explaining the first section of the article, which critiques the conventional scholarly practice of transliterating and not translating certain Arabic terms. As many of you know, it is normative practice in the field to use untranslated Arabic terms and to anglicize them. I recognize that many scholars view these non-translations positively. They presume that these terms should not be translated because either they are well known or they are untranslatable. Neither claim holds up to critical analysis. In the first case, when a scholar uses an untranslated Arabic term, the meaning that is expressed is whatever is ascribed to the term within the reception or target language, rather than the source language. Accordingly, a form of translation occurs even when a term is not transliterated and is left transliterated. Non-translations and partial translations are frequently mistranslations because they convey meanings dominant in the target language rather than the source language. Most untranslated Arabic terms in Western languages have prejudicial and inaccurate meanings, both in public and academic discourse, such that they cannot be recuperated, and using them compromises scholarship. Moreover, non-translations habitually misrepresent the fluidity of source languages by implying stasis in the meaning of an untranslated term. By not translating, scholars relinquish meaning to the dominant discourse. By translating and defining terms, scholars can guide meaning. In the second case, all concepts are translatable. Not translating insinuates that a term is incomprehensible in the target language and in the target culture. Scholars who do not translate an Arabic term communicate an explanation and an interpretation of the term as untranslatable. The notion of untranslatability is commonly motivated by or generative of xenophobia. Not translating a term implies that it is sacred and that it has essential characteristics that make it uniquely untranslatable. The claim of untranslatability is a claim of incommensurability. Yet most terms and the concepts they signify are neither sacred nor definable in essentialist ways. In general, terms have multiple meanings that change over time and vary according to context. Consequently, there are multiple potential translations for terms. Based on her extensive engagement with the notion of untranslatability, Barbara Casson advocated that untranslatable terms necessitate continuous translation as well as explanation and interpretation. Indeed, critical scholarship, in my opinion, entails at least two forms of translation: semantic, from a particular language such as Arabic, and contextual, from a particular socio-historical context. So I've discussed some of these critiques of non-translation in many previous writings, so I have rather extensive experience explaining the critique to scholars of Islamic studies, many of whom are remarkably stubborn in their refusal even to consider the possibility that translation is a better choice. I suspect that the aforementioned two reasons that scholars ascribe to not translating terms only partially motivate this ubiquitous practice. I believe that many scholars do not translate because they want to signal expertise in an exotic area of scholarship, or because they do not fully comprehend the term that is untranslated. To give an example of the latter, the anonymous reviewer of my decolonial translation article mistakenly claimed that the term Sharia law has an Arabic equivalent. This is simply wrong and reflects the reviewer's miscomprehension of the term Sharia, which is combined with adjectives like Islamiyya or Yahudiyya, but not with the many terms related to the category of law. I imagine that the problem of comprehension is both common and concealed. So these general comments emphasize the importance of critical translation in general. However, the article outlines an additional argument about non-translation as a form of secularization. Secular ideology underlies the notion of untranslatability ascribed to many Arabic terms. That is, the terms that are depicted as untranslatable in both scholarly and popular discourse are often those that secular ideology renders untranslatable. So here I'm using translation as a metonym for secularization. Accordingly, secular ideology translates the Islamic tradition into a religion, the non-secular. The emergence of secularism and its corollary religion led to the conversion of Sharia into Sharia. The term Sharia is intended to represent the English mispronunciation of the Arabic word Sharia. To clarify why Sharia is misconstrued as Sharia necessitates that we examine the shift between historical Islamic and contemporary secular context in which these terms are used. In the article, I surveyed late antique exegesis to illustrate that the relations between Deen, Sharia, fiqh in the historical Islamic tradition diverge from the relations between religion and غير علمانية, fiqh, Sharia, qanun, hukum, and akhlaq in contemporary discourse. The Arabic term deen is translated habitually and incorrectly as religion, but there is no term or concept for religion in pre-modern Islamic sources. The mistranslation of deen as religion instead of tradition or some other transhistorical term or concept results in mistranslating multiple Arabic terms as religious law or Sharia. The relation of terms changed in the modern era with the introduction of religion. Secularism generates religion and religious law. In turn, these two notions convert Sharia into Sharia in both Arabic and non-Arabic languages. So on the one hand, Sharia should be translated distinctly based on its fluctuating usages, and Islamic law is only one of its many potential translations. On the other hand, the primary meaning of Sharia is religious law, a term that reinforces colonial systems of meaning. The notion of Sharia is not only a secular translation, it is also a colonial transformation. Colonial governance imposed secularism in order to dominate colonized peoples. That is, colonial rulers used religious codes and religious courts to manage colonized groups, and the category of religion is itself part of a colonialist discourse. The category of religion generates a colonial system of meaning that transforms the Islamic tradition. That is, the notion of religion converted Sharia into its secular transmutation, Sharia, and colonial power disseminated and enforced this secular translation. Consequently, the use of the term Sharia is an act of conformity to, rather than resistance against, coloniality. The Islamic tradition is simultaneously translatable and being mistranslated in ways that manifest coloniality. I propose that translating the Islamic tradition from its source languages and socio-historical context involves precise translations, rigorous explanations, and critical interpretations. In the article, I provided a precise translation of deen based on a critical interpretation of religion and a rigorous explanation of law. Semantic and contextual translations reveal that multiple terms in Arabic should be translated as Islamic law and Islamic tradition. So although Sharia appears to be an untranslated term, it is actually a secular translation and conversion of Sharia. In Arabic, Sharia has multiple historical and contemporary meanings varying across time and place and genre. This critical observation may be extended beyond this particular terminology to encapsulate some general underlying forces in contemporary Islamic studies. Some recent scholarship in Islamic studies has sought to respond to colonial questions, such as, is Islam a religion? Or why does Islam differ from other religions? Although scholarly answers to these questions appear to point to the historical Islamic tradition, or to be steeped or seeped in Islamic texts and perspectives, they nonetheless are secular translations. The questions and their answers may use Islamic terminology and cite to Islamic sources, but the underlying concepts are secular. These colonial questions and answers encapsulate much of what motivates contemporary Islamic studies scholarship, and in turn, the spiraling futility of that scholarship, until and unless scholars of Islamic studies recognize how they are converting Islamic concepts through secular translations, their work will primarily reveal how secularism obfuscates the Islamic tradition. Decolonial translation is a first vital step for decolonizing Islamic studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Salaymeh, for this presentation and your analysis as well, especially also for merging the notion of critique in your text on Islamic law, which I think opens up various questions on the nature of Sharia, the role of ethics, and the decolonial turn in Islamic studies. And I think these are crucial, again, not only for us here at CIS, but also more broadly for those dealing with Islamic legal text or Islamic studies in general. Before I give the floor to Professor Quadri, I have a few questions myself. And depending on the time, we can pose them one by one or in bunch, whatever you prefer as well. My first question is that your intervention critically engages with the erroneous translation of Islamic law and Sharia, as you explained, and attempts to decolonize concepts of law and religion in Islamic thought, both of which you claim stem from colonial culture of scholarship. Now, I'm wondering if we replace the concept of religion with tradition, so the deen would mean tradition versus religion, aren't we trapped in the same type of epistemological predicament of referring to already existing sets of terms and conditions for the Arabic or Islamic equivalent, right? Is there not a thin line between borrowing and indigenizing the terms without obviously Islamizing them, right? And we all know that Islamic culture has always borrowed, but from a very different vantage point in the classical period in comparison to the modern period during which it borrowed from a very subordinate position. So how adequate is it to label deen as tradition without falling into some of the same pitfalls of applying modern concepts back into the classical tradition?
I thought you had a second question. That's the question. Should I answer that one?
Yeah, whatever you prefer.
Okay.
Give them a
So actually, yes. So it's fairly easy to, I think, to explain this, which is that I'm not using the concept of tradition as it is mythologized by modernity. So this isn't the concept of tradition or the notion of tradition that the myth of modernity produces. It's an analytical, transhistorical, transcultural concept of tradition. So first and foremost, all of the post-Enlightenment discourse that you hear about the dichotomization between tradition and modernity is, for me, part of the colonial discourse. So I reject that completely. So I'm not using the concept of tradition within that discursive framework. I would use a different term if I could find one that would encapsulate the concept as well, but I haven't found such a term. More importantly, tradition is not the only translation of deen. The point that I tried to emphasize repeatedly in the article, and that has to be emphasized again and again, is that you need to understand the semantic context. So sometimes I read texts where the concept of deen sounds like tradition. Sometimes I read it where it sounds like law. Sometimes I read it where it sounds like divine law. Sometimes it has different meanings, and therefore it should be translated distinctly depending on those meanings. I certainly would not support translating deen as only one way consistently. That's problematic.
Thank you for that, because I'm thinking about the decoloniality of the terms, and in relation to my own research, I have tried to discern, for instance, economics, the very modern term economics, from iqtisad or kasb, simply because they have a very different epistemic value, obviously, in the pre-modern tradition. Professor Qadri, do you want to go ahead with your first question, and then I can jump again?
Sure. So thanks very much for the invitation, Sami, and to the CASR for allowing me to engage with Lena, and thanks, Lena, for this great talk. Lena's, those who are probably on the call know that is very prolific and has a lot of very provocative and compelling, I want to say for me anyways, very compelling writings that reach back a few years now. And so much of what I find myself doing is agreeing with a lot of what you say and trying to sort of figure out where I place myself in it. So in some ways, I think any questions that I have are going to really be questions in which I sort of have qualms about my own thinking on this. And, very often I find things clarified. In other cases, I find that I still need some clarification. So I guess, I'm thinking, I formulated questions based on the article that you published in the Journal of Islamic Ethics. And then I'm trying to think of that alongside what some of the material that you presented here that's newer, or at least I'm hearing for the first time. I was really struck, I guess, by your kind of attention to language in the article, and the way that you're really insistent that when we think about terms and we think about translation, when we think about kind of moving from the source to the target language, you're kind of advocating what I took to be some kind of like very thick description of what the Arabic, and I want to make sure I use what the Arabic term, I think, right, that you want to get at, because you think that, not translating, for example, evades the kinds of entanglements, the kinds of interests that are bound up in these historical concepts. And like I said, I find this very compelling because I think there's a kind of specificity here that I think is important and really marks off both, without exotifying, marks off the kind of particularity of the Islamic cases and many Islamic cases, the multiple Islamic cases. But I guess it also, for me, raises kind of questions about like how about the threat of circularity. So, for example, just one that kind of stuck out to me is, when you talk about deen at some length, one of the definitions you gives a number of other terms to explain, right? And this is, I guess, pretty common when you look at, Arabic dictionaries and so on. So I think it's Ibn Abbas in the tafsir where you say where deen is glossed as minhaj and sunan and fara'id, for example. I think that was the one that came to my mind. And it seems like all of these concepts too have their own particular histories, particular deep kind of like explanations that need to happen. And so I guess like my question is like, are we in a position where we've sort of kind of, do we give up on the possibility of kind of getting to a, and I know you're kind of, this maybe speaks to your kind of suspicion around origins, but getting back to the possibility of a kind of deep meaning on some kind of firm basis. And I guess to link it to something that you said, it struck me that you said, for example, that critique begins with not making assumptions, right? And it seems to me like the kind of like philosophy of language that you're putting forth is this kind of hermeneutical circle, which has like a long history, and yet. And you actually in the article also talk about it in terms of relationality. And I find that very compelling, but I guess like the idea that we're not making assumptions then seems to run against the grain against that a little bit to my mind, because I guess one of the main planks of that way of thinking is to say precisely that assumptions are sort of baked into all of what we're doing. And the idea is that we're kind of like much happier with the idea that that bias is baked into what we're doing, or assumptions, let's say, are baked into what we're doing, and not the idea that we're kind of drilled down. And so I guess that little bit from something you said towards the beginning of your talk kind of struck me. And I wonder how you can speak to both of those at the same time.
Okay, so the point about not making assumptions is a kind of pedagogical point about being very humble and questioning our own ideas and assumptions. So what I mean by that is both that we should question what terms mean. So I shouldn't assume that I know what D means, right? I should actually read the text and figure out what they mean within the context of those texts. I shouldn't make assumptions about the broader issues of historiography, for example. I shouldn't assume that I know what the history is. I should actually do the research. I mean, it's kind of a sort of basic issue of do the research about all of it, because there may be very uncritical building blocks that you're using without realizing, right? So that if what you are trying to do, and as I gave an example when I was talking about modern Islam, is if you're trying to do critical work on modern Islam, but you're using an uncritical building block, and it's because you're not questioning Shaht, for example, then you're on this shaky foundation. So that what I mean by no assumptions is really a kind of pedagogical guide. It's not a positivist methodology. It's just sort of broad advice that I like to give because I find that it's helpful. In terms of the terminology itself, the key for me is that there's fluidity and plurality of the terms. I don't see the circularity that you're talking about. And so this could be because I'm starting from a basic presumption that the terms and concepts that I'm using are not essentialist. So they are broad and they don't have specific attributes or qualities. And therefore, they are themselves very flexible. And that's the point. I don't want to use terms and concepts that are too narrow. And I will only use them when I define them in ways that can be transhistorical, transcultural, or I will say when they're not transhistorical or transcultural. But you are right that I am quite obsessive about the language and this is something that's very important within the School of Decolonial Critique, and that is for decoloniality. And that's that you have to change the discourse, and you can't change the discourse simply by shifting the terms. It's something that I discuss in the article. I think that a lot of people think that, well, so if everyone, for example, is talking about race in North America, well, if we talk about race in the Islamic tradition, then we have done a critical move. But actually you haven't, because all you've done is shifted the terms, you haven't shifted the discourse. Moreover, very often you're taking critical race theory tools and applying them in an uncritical way on the Islamic tradition. And what you're actually doing is a form of intellectual colonialism. So even though your intention appears to be to engage critically with the concept of race, you're doing it in a way that's actually super problematic. So does that answer though the questions that you posed? Because I feel like I may not have captured the circularity question.
Yeah, no, I think that's on point. I mean, I guess I don't mean circularity necessarily as a bad thing, and I think maybe there's a kind of way that we use the term which is like a negative, which has a long history also. But I guess there's a way, a kind of theory of language, a theory of a philosophy of language in which circularity isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It's actually something. It's kind of very, very, very resonant with what you say in the article, which is precisely that in order to understand terms, we need to sort of position them with respect to other terms. And that's kind of how we have, and the kind of instability that you speak to is actually also something that is not a bad thing, but it's actually something that's a positive. I guess this raises the question, maybe your answer is simply that you're not bothered by it. This raises the question of whether we can get to some kind of firm basis, right? Because if the idea is we're constantly moving from term to term, then we're not. Then that kind of presumption that we can sort of arrive at a firm basis, and maybe here, that we can arrive at a firm basis is perhaps not possible.
What do you mean by firm basis?
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, is there a kind of, and I think, you know, if you, maybe your antipathy towards origins and your antipathy towards essences kind of absolves that problem, right? So maybe that's what's underlying. And I guess, you know, someone like Gadamer or someone would precisely want to get away from those sorts of things. If I can maybe push this to another question, Sami, if that's okay. One of the things that struck me, and the way you, for most of the article, kind of go about it, is really by focusing on things in their discursive contexts, right? And I think you use the term discursive context in a couple of places. But I think also at one point you talk about kind of socio-historical context, and yet, you know, that's something that I struggle a little bit with, right? Because in some ways everything is kind of everything becomes discursive, right? And so just in terms of, I mean, do you have a sense for like thinking about how these terms work that is not just kind of positioning terms within each, you know, in relation to one another, or is there some kind of deeper, again, kind of, you know, betraying kind of what I'm thinking here, but is there some sort of kind of a more empirical, let's say, historical context that we can rely on as well? To sort of make sense of what a particular concept might mean. I don't know if that's a clear question.
Okay, so let me clarify something. I think, because I hear you saying something like, does the text have independent meaning? Like the Stanley Fish type question. And so to be clear, I don't ascribe specific meanings to texts. I look to see how interpretive communities understood those texts. So I don't, as a scholar, I wouldn't make a claim that a specific text says something other than quoting it, right? But how it's understood and interpreted is the key issue for me. And that does come from a historical context. So the other aspect of it is, yes, I did talk about discursive context because that was what the historical evidence I was looking at gives me was a discursive context. But as my book shows, when you are dealing with any kind of historical question, I think you should look at all the sources that are available, all the historical sources, Islamic, non-Islamic, the context, the relations between those sources. This is what animates a lot of my research on the relationship between Jewish and Islamic law. It's this issue of trying to understand the ways in which traditions are situated vis-a-vis other traditions, so that there's constantly a dialogical relationship. But I don't, just to be clear, think of tradition as a discursive concept, right? I mean, I made it clear in the definition that tradition is a changing array of ideas and practices shared by groups over time. It's ideas and practices. It's not only a discursive situation. Does that answer your question? I think okay, good.
Yes, I have lots more, but I don't want to monopolize. Sami, I can give it back to you.
Great. I would like to discuss something you bring up at the very end of your piece. You link the developing field of Islamic ethics, which is obviously closely related to the categories of quote unquote Islamic law and Sharia, to colonial scholarship. And I'm wondering if it's only the naming or the origin of the field as well. You know, granted, the very field of Islamic ethics, or even the concept as such, did not exist in the pre-modern period. Instead, they were other terms that denoted, you know, virtues and moral traits such as akhlaq and adab, which is its own genre, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, despite the problematic naming of the field or the subject of Islamic ethics, nowadays there are various themes and topics that could be positioned under the banner of ethics, quote unquote, which I don't think should be devoid of broader theological, legal, even philosophical underpinnings, such as, you know, Islamic finance and economics, bioethics, even gender, so on and so forth. So can you say more about the origin of its colonial scholarship, and where would you then situate these topics, if not under some type of ethical studies in Islam? And granted, again, you know, these days we have subjects such as Islamic ethics. So I would obliterate those and, for instance, introduce, instead of topics in Islamic ethics, we could have topics in adab, topics in akhlaq, and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering what's your take on that?
Yes, great. Okay, so to explain, The article was published, as you noticed, in the Journal of Islamic Ethics. And much of the impetus, sort of the motivation of the article, was the result of engagement with certain scholars who work in the field of Islamic ethics. And what I was attempting to explain to them over many years was that the shift in interest in the concept of Islamic ethics is the result of the secularization of the category of law. That it's not a simple, and that's not a denial that there is a category of Islamic ethics that is obvious in Arabic texts. Obviously, there's a category of akhlaq. I mean, there's no denying that. But the increased emphasis on ethics as an object of study goes along with, it's sort of hand in hand with a relinquishing of law, a transformation of the meaning of law, so that we can't actually talk about the ways in which the field of Islamic ethics has burgeoned, right? I mean, with the establishment of the center in Qatar, but also with so much emphasis on this concept of ethics, without also seeing that it's about a marginalization of Islamic law. Does that make sense, Sami? Can you see what I'm saying?
I see what you're getting at. Yeah, I understand the context. I just have another brief question, and then maybe we can, circle back to you, Professor Quadri, and then we can open up for the Q&A. It's a brief question, and obviously it has to do with Sharia as the divine law, right? Many scholars would agree that Sharia is the divine law, which is obviously ontologically different from fiqh as understanding, as how the legal specialists interpreted the divine law. But in light of this distinction, how does one account for what the fuqaha and ulama have been doing as following what they believe is the divine law to the best of their ability, right? So even though there is a degree of separation between fiqh and sharia, there is also an overlap. So I'm wondering if you would agree that fiqh, at the end of the day, can be a manifestation, although humanly driven, of the divine law.
I've written about precisely that distinction many times and explained that fiqh is the human interpretation of Sharia, of divine law. So that, I think, to me is quite clear within the text. It's important to understand that it's only in the modern era that Sharia became, or maybe late medieval, but it's really a later transformation that Sharia came to be equivalent to fiqh, right? That distinction became harder to sort of differentiate, and people started to use Sharia more and more in lieu of fiqh. But that's not really, to me, in any way a problem, because within the Islamic tradition, there is a pluriversal understanding of law. So not only do Muslims recognize that Muslim jurists have access to the Islamic divine law, Sharia al-Islamiyya, and then can have fiqh from that understanding or interpretation, they also recognize that there is Sharia Yahudiyya and that there is fiqh there. And it's not an accident that these terms were used by the Gayonim, by Jews writing in Arabic, Arab Jews under the Islamic Empire. So these terms are like terms that we use today for law and divine law, and they're not specific to Islam. And that's also part of the problem with the non-translation of Sharia, is it presents it as somehow being specifically for Muslims or identified with Muslims, when historically that's simply not true.
Okay, so Professor Quadri, maybe back to you before we take some questions from the audience.
Sure. I really appreciate the comment about ethics, and I think especially the discussion that you had, which I think really clarified a lot for me about your happiness to use the word law, right? Whereas there's a reticence maybe to speak about Islamic law and so on, and your kind of discussion about what law might mean. I think that was really helpful for me. Something that I feel maybe a bit uneasier about is thinking a little bit about what you kind of what you said in a previous response about, and in the talk itself, about not assigning value. This is kind of a methodological question, not assigning value to different sources. And I mean, maybe I'm just repeating a version of the question I asked before, but maybe this might help clarify my own thinking on it. It seems to me like, it's a perfectly reasonable thing as part of his historiographical attempt to assign values to different sorts of texts, right? Different sorts of sources. And it also seems that the idea that, again, this kind of philosophy of language in which you are in which you're kind of putting concepts in juxtaposition or in relation, let's say, to one another, is one in which it's perfectly, it makes, sorry, I'm trying to kind of make sense of it here. It makes perfect sense to assign certain values to, and to embrace, let's say, value assigning, right? That kind of when you put things in relation to one another and you give up on the possibility that you're going to get to a kind of independent meaning of the text, that what you're doing is basically taking on the possibility that that the values that you are the value rather that you are assigning to particular texts are perfectly legitimate. All right, that again, that you're kind of embracing bias, embracing your own value judgments, rather than simply saying, "I don't do that." Is that a clear question? I don't know if that's clear.
Yes, but I think that we're looking at this from different perspectives. So, as a historian, when I'm talking about assigning value, I'm criticizing and critiquing the philological tendency to claim that Islamic sources are basically lies, or that they're ideologically constructed texts. So what I'm talking about is that kind of broad scale claim about unreliability, lack of authenticity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that what you're talking about, I would describe differently, which would be that I would identify a text as being orthodox. I would identify it as being normative or non-normative or heterodox or any other such things. But I personally am not engaged in the development of normative ideas, because I'm working as a historian on historical texts, and I don't believe that I have the right to make those kinds of normative value judgments, right? I think that actually this is sort of what gets into a problematic conflation of roles that I see among a lot of contemporary scholars who want to both be scholars and Muslim public figures simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is that if you are at a global North secular institution and you're playing the role of a Muslim public figure, regardless of what your intentions are, you're participating in a colonization of the tradition. You have no right to participate in that way with the tradition, because usually you're somebody who has not been trained within the tradition. So there's a problem with mixing colonial epistemologies with normative objectives from within the tradition that I see happening over and over and over again in the field. And I know my role very clearly. And so I don't participate in that. You know, I'm a historian, I do critical history, I'm a lawyer, I do legal research, and it's not my job to assign the kinds of values that people within a tradition assign to their texts. That's what they get to do. That's not what I get to do. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and I very much sympathize. I mean, I guess my worry is that we don't kind of absolve ourselves of all positionality altogether, because of course we may not be participating in that particular normative enterprise, the one in which someone is both a Muslim public intellectual and a scholar of some sort. But it's hard to evade that we're participating in some kind of normative enterprise altogether, right? And so to say simply that, historians are sort of exempt from that or outside of that seems to me to go too far.
Yeah, and that's not what I said. I said it's impossible to escape positionality, but because of that, you have to choose the positionality that you're engaged in. And what I'm saying is that my work is critical. It's not just that I do have a normative position. I don't believe that historical scholarship is objective or neutral. I don't believe in objectivity or neutrality. So obviously there's a positionality. Obviously there's a normative objective, but it cannot be the objective of normative value making within the tradition, because I am not in an Islamic institution. I am at a Western global North institution, and it's simply illegitimate for me to participate in that kind of activity. So, and I also want to go back to something that I forgot to say when you mentioned the hesitation about using the term Islamic law. I don't think it's an accident that for the most part, the people who hesitate are people who don't have training in law. You know, consistently, the other scholars and I who have legal training find no problem with the concept of Islamic law. And then it's other scholars who try to tell us, often the anthropologists, but also other scholars who try to tell us that it's inappropriate to use the concept of law. And I think this has something to do with having basically accepted a very secular modern conceptualization of law as state positive law effectively. So that's one thing. And the other thing about the category of Islamic ethics that Sami asked me about earlier, I also wanted to make clear that something similar happens with maqasid al-Sharia as a kind of interest in trying to find principles in ways that are effectively palatable to mainstream global North discourse. I mean, I see both Islamic ethics and maqasid al-Sharia participating in that kind of apologetics, in my opinion.
Thanks for clarifying that. Let's take some questions from the audience. We have at least 3 of them. Sami Ayub, hi Sami. He's asking, thank you so much, Professor Salaymeh, for this thought-provoking lecture. My question is, where is the place of indigenous epistemology in this emerging critical scholarship? In Professor Salaymeh's remarks, she invited us to consider historiography in relation to claims of orthodoxy, but this exercise is a positioning in relation to the Islamic tradition. How does Professor Salaymeh conceive of the madhab, for example? It seems to me that historiography here could lead to the displacement.
Okay, Sami, thanks for the question, but it's not exactly clear. I think there's a difference between indigenous knowledge and indigenous epistemology. And drawing again on the comments I just made to Junaid, I don't have anything to say about indigenous epistemology. That's not my area of expertise, and I don't have a right to get involved in that. I do use indigenous knowledge, if you want to call it that, in doing critical scholarship. But it's probably helpful just to say something about how really too many people are using the term decolonization as a metaphor to cite to Tang and I can't remember the other person's author, the article on decolonization is not a metaphor. So decolonial epistemology is not only about using indigenous epistemologies or indigenous forms of knowledge, it's also about the deconstructive aspect. And so the deconstruction is an act of critique that doesn't necessarily come from indigenous sources. But it's not clear to me, maybe somebody else has an idea of what he was trying to say. To ask.
Well, he's also asking about, where would you place the notion, the concept of madhab in this discourse, right?
I don't really see why that's a question, because it's a legal school. I've written about it. I mean, my book is basically about legal circles and networks that preceded legal schools. There is far too much attention within the field to orthodox legal schools. It's part of the ways in which the field obsesses over orthodoxy without realizing it and just collapses Islam into these orthodox forms of Islam. But the historiography there is pretty, it's not complicated.
Okay.
But I don't fully understand Sami's question, so that's.
Okay. There's another question, anonymous attendee, and I promise, Lena, it's not me. Doesn't this philosophy of language makes gaps between communities? It seems that it leads to have no shared ground between Islamic tradition and other traditions. The word religion,
word religion.
Yes, the word deen cannot be translated as it is difficult to convey its meaning to other languages. How would we solve this problem?
Okay, so I think I made it clear, but maybe it needs to be emphasized again, that I am advocating for translation. Translation is a form of ground between traditions. That's the whole point of translation. If you don't translate, then you're making the claim of untranslatability, and then you're saying that traditions can't understand each other. The issue about the translation, of the word deen, as I emphasized, can be translated in multiple ways. And it's not a problem. It's just about being precise and looking at the text and actually translating the word depending on its usage. I think I've answered that question. Okay.
Yeah. Sarah Hamid has another question. I have a question about the idea that someone who may be a public Muslim figure in the Western Global North Academy is not trained in the tradition. My sense is that traditions can be inhabited in different ways and that there are continuities that are not captured if we assume that Islamic institutions should be the exclusive carriers and voice of the tradition. Muslims in the West and trained in the Western Academy make claims that they are continuing the tradition despite lacking quote unquote traditional training. What are your thoughts on that? I think in part you already.
Yeah, I think I already explained that it's about the colonial power. It's not about, as humanitarian interventions are still forms of colonialism. The intentionality of the actors involved is really not relevant effectively. So if there are scholars who want to be involved in the tradition, but they are not allowed inside orthodox spaces, which is obviously a valid issue, then they should create their own spaces. But creating their own spaces within global North institutions that exert colonial power is just problematic. Like that they can't sort of escape their own positionality, even if they are claiming to do so.
Can I follow up on that one? Maybe just to take it in a different.
Yes, go ahead.
I mean, I totally share Lena's kind of problem with that, and I tend to agree also that there are really unacknowledged ways that people who operate within the academy who happen to be within Global North Academy, which is the right thing to say, right? Who happen to have certain identities, are operating within those same paradigms and then acting kind of in colonial ways. So I totally agree. I guess one of the things that maybe this question, the discomforts that maybe this question raises is are there gradations to this, right? I mean, is there a way in which, is it that, for example, I think thinking back to people who sort of construct their own normative communities within the tradition, and within the academy, are often people who are marginalized from standard Muslim communities, right? So queer people, for example, who don't always find a mosque to go to or something, find that there is an institutional basis in which they can ground themselves and coordinate and organize themselves. And so there's a way that they carve out a place for themselves where they otherwise might not have been able to. Do you see that as somehow different than the thing you're unhappy with?
I think that people can advocate as they want in local communities. I mean, this is sort of my critique of colonial feminism. The question is about when people try to take a stance and tell people somewhere else what they should and shouldn't do, that everything becomes more complicated, right? So if what you're doing in your own, whatever you do in your own community is your own business, and you can do that with your own community. But taking on the colonial role of telling people somewhere else what they should and shouldn't do is, for me, the problem.
Thank you. If Professor Quadri, do you have any final remarks on that, or are there any?
I mean, I have lots of questions, but I feel like I've asked a lot of questions already, so I don't want to take more time.
We went a little bit over time as well.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Salaymeh, for your time and presentation. Thank you, Professor Quadri, for your participation. It was a pleasure having you both. Also, many thanks again to MF CASR for co-hosting us, and to all of you who have been listening and watching. Do follow our events at MF CASR webpage, and we're going to make sure to also upload the recording online and on YouTube. Thank you again, and take care.
Thank you.